Yep, what is that I have up on the board? What's that formula of? What process?
Chemical cellular respiration.
Say it out loud.
Cellular respiration.
Just say it out loud.
Balance that equation. You have to do stoichiometry.
Oh, I forgot about that. I don't want to take chemistry.
I took intro and I cried.
Oh, then you should be able to balance that.
It was called Google, and my friends helped me out on it, so I don't remember.
Yeah. It's not balanced, but those are the basic requirements. Those are the reactants and the products. Now you will notice in that formula, it tells you more than just the fact that it is a chemical equation. C6H12 is what? What kind?
Glucagon.
Not glucagon, that's a hormone. Glucose. Okay, where do we get that from?
Food.
Food. So which system is responsible for acquiring that?
Digestive.
Digestive. But then you'll notice next to it we have oxygen. What system is responsible for that? Respiratory. Okay, so the reactants, the acquisition of the reactants are basically the job of two systems, digestion and respiratory. Now let's take a look at the products. Carbon dioxide,
Respiratory.
respiratory. Water.
Digestive. Well, it's whole body, isn't it?
Well, these are now, we don't have to ingest, we're making it.
Right.
So
Renal?
how are we going to balance that out?
Wouldn't the renal balance it out?
Kidneys would be part of. When you exhale on a cold window, what happens?
You get the condensation.
Condensation. So we also balance it out through the respiratory system. And then ATP gets used by whomever requires it. So on the product side, which those three things are made within the body now, notice the respiratory system is involved there as well. So when we put a job description to the respiratory system, we basically give it the function gas exchange. Most people just say, well, that's how we get the oxygen. No, that's only one aspect of the function. You also have to deal with the waste products or the byproducts. And so, in essence, we get rid of the carbon dioxide, or a good portion of it, and a percentage of the water. So the respiratory system is involved. So we get oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, gas exchange. Now I know some of you have not had chemistry, some of you have, so I'm not going to relive the horrors, but a lot of chemistry is going to crop up from here on out, because now the explanation of a lot of things has to do with the chemical aspect of stuff. So in order for a chemical reaction to never stop, what has to occur? Those of you that didn't have chemistry, this is difficult. Those of you that did have chemistry, this shouldn't be as difficult. If I want to continually create heat from burning wood, what do I have to do so the fire never goes out?
Feed it.
I have to feed it, so I have to keep giving it what?
Nutrients.
Which is
Wood.
wood. So I have to keep supplying reactants. So if I want to continually produce ATP, what do I have to continually supply? glucose
Oxygen.
and oxygen. Okay? So I have to continually supply that by hook or by crook. So we eat all the time and we're inhaling all the time. But just as important to continually producing, okay, if the ashes of that fire we got to keep going get too high, what are they going to do to the ability to keep that flame going? They're going to smother it. So at some point you got to remove the ashes, you got to remove the byproduct, and that's the same thing here. Not only do we have to constantly deliver the necessary ingredients, we got to remove the material from affecting the production of ATP. So that's why when you take a look at the overall description of the respiratory system, its first and foremost job is gas exchange. Now, in doing that, it does some other things. So, for example, by continually exhaling carbon dioxide, we prevent certain acids from building up in the blood. Because the way carbon dioxide is treated in the blood, it converts it to an acid called carbonic acid. So if we retain too much carbon dioxide, the pH of our blood will go down. You become acidotic. And that's what happens to people with emphysema, because they can't breathe out carbon dioxide. But that's a secondary effect as a result of the gas exchange. Okay? So when we're taking a look at the functions of the respiratory system, many of the descriptions of the function are centered around the concept of gas exchange. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. Does that make sense? Now, in order for ATP production to go unaffected, we have to carry out 3 exchange processes. We have to carry out 3 exchange processes. The 3 processes are, and I am giving them to you in the order at which they occur. Process number 1 is pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation. By definition, so this has a definition to it. Pulmonary ventilation is gas exchange between the atmosphere and the blood. Gas exchange between the atmosphere and the blood. The second process is called external,
Bless you.
external respiration. respiration. External respiration. That is defined as gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. Gas exchange between the lungs and the blood. The third process is internal respiration. Internal respiration is defined as gas exchange between the blood and it just got too quiet. Tissue cells. Because where are the mitochondria and everything? Are they in the blood? No, where are they? In the cells. So that's where we got to get the oxygen. And the mitochondria are going to take the oxygen and the glucose and they're going to make ATP, but as byproducts then they have carbon dioxide and water. So those we have to get out of the cell. So as you can see, everything is an exchange process. And anything that affects any one of those processes will have an effect on the next one in the sequence. So if I affect your pulmonary ventilation, I don't know, let's say I put a noose around your neck. Hang them. I have now prevented the other two from occurring. Even though I didn't get to them directly. But by stopping pulmonary ventilation, I automatically shut off the others. You'll die. So noose around the neck, I don't know, so anything that blocks the air passageway. So anything that obstructs the air passageway. So anything like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. I have COPD. I have an elephant sitting on my chest. Makes it hard to breathe. Makes you hard to listen to. No, my brother has COPD. One of the funniest things is to get him to start losing his breath. You can't catch it. You get him laughing.
That's awful.
Oh, but it's hysterical. His face turns red and everything. I mean, wouldn't that
Have a
make
heart
sense?
attack.
He's gonna have a heart attack.
Yeah.
I said, that's the icing on the cake at this point. He can't even talk.
Smoker?
And every time, yeah, but every time you laugh, what do?
Yeah.
Your diaphragm contracts for you to exhale, but he can't. I said, look on the bright side, you're gonna die laughing.
At least they were happy.
I guess.
You can't do that. He's gonna get sick. He's gonna get sick anyway. That's not my problem. He's the one that smoked. It's all about the choices we make.
This is true.
Yep, yep. So those conditions, one of their big things is because they obstruct the flow of air. They make pulmonary ventilation very difficult. Thus, the other two processes are slowed down as well. They're not stopped, but they're affected. Because everything is based on exchange, not just one way, it's exchange. External respiration is anatomically connected to pulmonary because what thing do they share in common? Look at your definitions.
Exchange, gas exchange.
That's okay. But
With the blood.
the lungs. Where one ends, the other begins. So anything that affects blood to or from the lungs is going to affect external respiration. And that'll kill you just as quick. In fact, that's how some people die. So let's say they have a blood clot that goes to the lungs and prevents the blood from getting into the lungs. They can get air into the lungs, but they can't get it into the blood. And that's what happens in things called pulmonary embolism. And then internal respiration, that's obviously going to be inside the body now, but this is going to be the number one cause of death for most people, because you're going to prevent the internal respiration from occurring, let's say within the heart. If you have a blocked coronary artery, you won't get the blood to that tissue. And notice, what structures do external and internal respiration have in common? Blood. So anything that affects the blood will affect internal respiration. So when you have a heart attack, you basically stopped internal respiration, at least in that section of the heart. When you have a stroke, you stopped internal respiration in that area of the brain. Make sense? So in order for ATP to continually be produced, we have to continually perform those three exchange processes. Now the one that we want to concentrate on is the pulmonary ventilation. The other, that's because it's basically mechanical means. The other two rely on chemistry, so I'll actually talk more of those specifically in lecture. But pulmonary ventilation, here we can basically tie in the anatomy of the respiratory system to the function of pulmonary ventilation. Okay? All right. Now, gas exchange, pulmonary ventilation is gas exchange between the atmosphere and the lungs. So that means we have to take air in the room, let's say, and get it into the lungs. So let's see how that occurs. Basically, when we take a look at the anatomy of the respiratory system, ultimately we're just looking at a whole bunch of tubes, or if you were comparing this to a building, you'd be looking at duct work. Okay, so the vents and the ducts and everything like that. So we start anatomically, we start up here in the entrance in, that would be the nasal cavity. I'll go over more of its specific anatomy and functions in lecture, but that's where we'll start. And then from there, nasal cavity, we then go into the throat, which is called the pharynx. The throat is the pharynx. And this is an area where two systems overlap. Digestive system and respiratory system. They both use the pharynx. At the base of the pharynx is where the two systems part ways. So at the base of the pharynx, we then go into the larynx and the trachea for the respiratory system, and then right behind that we have the esophagus. And this winds up being a problem Because occasionally, the material carried by one system is going to get into the other's tract. In the case of the digestive system, if you get air into the digestive system, it's really not all that big a deal. But the digestive system, the materials it deals with, have a greater density. They're solids and liquids. So they pose a bigger problem if they get into the respiratory tract, especially the solids, because it can do what?
Get into your lungs.
Oh, it might not even get that far. Yeah, it can cause choking. So it can cause choking. So it can lodge in here. And when you lodge, you stop. Pulmonary ventilation. You stop that, and so Junior will do what? Or person will do what? What?
Just thinking of the movie Mrs. Doubtfire where she like
What?
she gives the Heimlich to some dude. Robin Williams, the Mrs. Doubtfire.
I never saw it.
Really? Just as like up like an old woman.
It's a horrible.
I've never seen it. So explain.
Just they give the Heimlich to someone and it's funny.
Oh, okay. I've never seen it.
You need to watch it.
I should watch it.
Well, she said you shouldn't.
Oh,
But
I don't really think it's that great of a movie.
I'm not a Robert Williams fan.
Oh, well then you definitely won't
When
like it.
I heard that he offed himself, I was like, okay, that's the funniest thing he's done. Yeah, it wasn't. You should have did it funnier. Like in the middle of a movie set. Now that would have been funny.
why? 'Cause then the video would be released and you could watch it.
Yeah. But no, you didn't do it that way. Well, that's his business. All right. So now we go through this network of tubes. So from the larynx, we go into this tube here. This is called the trachea. And you'll see the trachea has these cartilaginous rings that keep it open. Because the way gases and stuff that you're going to see move here, they move by pressure changes. And if it was flexible like a balloon, the pressure changes would cause that flexible material to collapse, and then it would be very difficult to open. From the trachea, we go into the bronchi, and these are the primary bronchi. They feed into the lungs, and then they're going to break up, break up, break up. They're going to branch, 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 branch. They will branch until they eventually get down to here. A little bit better. These structures, these little hollow microscopic spheres, these are called alveoli. The alveoli are basically the functional units of the lung. The whole idea of ventilation is to get gas exchange between the atmosphere and the alveoli. So I can take the word lungs out of the definition and put in alveoli. So pulmonary ventilation is gas exchange between the atmosphere and the alveoli. The reason why that is a functional unit is because that's what the blood system is connected to in the lung, the alveoli. So that's where we want to get the exchange. exchange to occur. Okay? And here we're looking at the exchange process. Notice oxygen coming in, carbon dioxide coming out. So here's the alveoli, ventilation here. Since the blood vessels are connected to the alveoli, this is where pulmonary ventilation and external respiration connect. So what we're showing here is external respiration, gas exchange between the blood and the alveoli. But you don't have external respiration unless you first have pulmonary ventilation. So as I said, that's what we want to concentrate on. Now, in order to get air to move, for ventilation to occur, we have to understand something about air. Okay? In order to explain and understand how ventilation occurs, we have to understand the nature of what we're ventilating for, and that's for air. Air, if you were in chemistry, is basically considered a mixture of gases. As part of that mixture, oxygen is part of that mixture. Now, in order for ventilation to occur, I have to get the air in the room to somehow get into my lungs, into the alveoli, and then exchange, and then force the air in the alveoli back out into the atmosphere, and then repeat it again. So now I have to require the air to move. In order to get air to move, we have to follow a rule. Air movement always goes from high pressure to an area of low pressure. Didn't we talk about this when we talked about blood and everything? That's because in chemistry, liquids and gases are considered what forms of matter?
Doesn't happen with osmosis.
Not osmosis. Liquids and gases are both considered fluids. So generally, in many aspects, they behave the same. Because since they're fluids, they flow. Most people think of fluids as being a liquid, but gases are also in that as well. So in order to get a fluid to flow, whether it would be blood fluid or gases in the air, we always go from high pressure to low pressure. So that means I have to, at some point, make the atmosphere the high pressure, and I have to make the area inside the lungs or the alveoli the low pressure. Okay? That has to occur. Now there's a couple of ways you could do it. You could sit here and every time you want to inhale, open up and hope that the pressure in the atmosphere just goes up to force air down your throat. Is that going to happen? Or you create the scenario where the pressure in your lungs drops below the atmospheric pressure, which pretty much stays constant throughout the day. And that's probably what's going to happen. So we have to create a scenario where the pressure in our lungs drops, so we pull the air in. If it's the other way around, if you find yourself in a situation where the pressure outside your body has to increase at the right time to push air into your lungs, you're on a ventilator. So you're probably not in a good position to fight that. Okay? So how are we going to get the pressure in our lungs to drop? Well, let's do some further investigation on gases or fluids. When we take a look at gases, okay, we start investigating into chemistry and physics, and we come up with this. A chemical formula. Pivnert. PV equals nRT. Does anybody know what this is, you chemistry people?
I don't recall learning this.
It's been like 2 or 3 years since I took
What?
chemistry. I took chemistry like 2 years ago.
Okay, so then this should
It's not there. Is it pressure and volume equals, I forget what N is. Isn't R a constant?
R is a constant,
And then T is time.
not time.
What is it?
It's hot in here.
Temperature.
Temperature.
And then what is N?
Pressure times volume is equal to N, is the amount,
Okay.
number of moles.
Uh,
R is a constant, very good, and then T is temperature. This formula is called your ideal gas law. This explains the behavior of gases at which we need to take place in order to breathe. Okay? Now, under normal conditions, the amount of gas, the N, that we're using is relatively small. Yeah, but Dr. Ryan, yeah, but the whole amount of the air in the room, but the amount of air we're asking to move in the room is relatively small. So to make life easier, they say, since it's a small amount of gas we're looking at, let's assume we don't need that N in the formula. And since we don't have the N, we don't need the R, which is a mathematical constant, which is based on N. So that eliminates a couple of variables. So now let's bring the T over. So now we have this shortened up, simplified formula. Temperature times volume is equal to pressure times volume is equal to temperature. Okay? Now we have to understand how equations work. Okay, we have to understand how equations work here. This is not a respiratory thing. This is now just a basic algebra math concept. Okay? When you are, and I think I went over this when we talked about blood pressure, many of the same things apply. When we see we have an equal sign, that means we have an equation. Equal. Whatever number I have on this side has to be the same number on that side. Has to. If this number on this side goes up, to be equal, what does this one have to do?
Go up.
Go up by how much?
Same.
amount. So if it goes up by 5 on one side, it has to go up by 5 on the other. If it goes down by 5 on one side, it has to go down by 5 on the other. Whatever you do to one side of the equation, you have to do to the other. You remember those rules? That's why. Because you cannot break the equality unless you're doing inequalities. Oh. What?
That's stuff.
The inequalities? Oh, you should have saw, I had my young one, she was ready to cry trying to do
Oh,
those.
yeah.
Because I was just pissing her off.
I believe that too. Oh, yeah.
I don't know how to do this. Well, I do, and I'm not going to show you. Mommy said you should. So. It was, and then I said to her, it wasn't in the divorce agreement. She had no idea.
What?
It's not in the decree. I was blessed or cursed with the ability to do math.
Cursed.
Cursed at this point, because now so somehow every math equation comes to my house, graphs or whatever. So I was cursed at this point. Okay. So when you're on either side of the equal sign, if you go up or you go down, you go up or down by the same amount. We call that proportional. That's called proportional. Now, what if you're on the same side of the equal sign? Things are a little bit different. So I only have, on this here, I have the pressure and the volume on the same side of the equal sign. When you are on the same side of the equal sign, if one value goes up, the other one on the same side has to go down to maintain equality. So to illustrate that, because if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand this law here, which explains how we breathe. Let's say I have the numbers 10 times 4 equals what?
40.
40. Okay? Now, assuming the 40 never changes, that's constant. If I raise number 4 to 8, what do I have to lower 10 to
5.
to still be 40? So notice when one went up, the other went down. If I started here and I raised 5 to 10, I would have to lower 8 to 4. So it doesn't matter to maintain equality on the same side. One goes up, the other has to go down. They have to move in opposite directions. We call that inversely proportional. Notice the inverse is if you cut one in half, you double the other one. That's called inversely proportional. So now we can say, we can take this basic algebra concept and I can say that pressure and volume are inversely proportional as long as temperature remains constant. Does that make sense? Pressure and volume are inversely proportional. I think the book says inversely related. Well, some guy kind of figured this out, and his name was Boyle. And this became known as Boyle's law. It says the pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to its volume at constant temperature. Now, he made that up because that was back in like the 1700s, and probably because he understood math. It's not necessarily a chemistry concept, it's a math concept applied to chemistry.
So should we know it if it's not right?
What?
Should we know it if it's not right?
What do you mean?
I thought you just said it wasn't right. Whatever his law was, I thought you just said that.
No, I said, no, his law is right,
Oh. Okay.
but it's basically a mathematical concept. It's not just Boyle's law, he just figured it out with relationship to gases. But that's a math problem. It doesn't even have to be in relation to anything, it's just the way the numbers always work. But in physiology and chemistry, we call it Boyle's law. Pressure and volume are inversely related. So that means if the volume goes up, the pressure will go down. Well, didn't we have to cause the pressure to drop in our lungs to get the air into it? Yeah. So what that is saying is, if I can increase the size of our lungs, increase their volume, the pressure inside will go down. Hopefully long enough that air will flow into it and fill them. Does that make sense? So how are we going to do that? Now we have to take a look at the anatomy. When we take a look at the lungs, the lungs are a container, but they're inside another container. The other container is our chest wall. It's our thorax. So if I want the lungs to expand, I'm going to require our chest to expand. So that means I got to cause the ribs and muscles to move. So if we take a look at the anatomy of the chest, we've got the ribs. And you'll notice, we don't have the skeleton here, but you'll notice the ribs don't come off parallel to the ground. They don't come straight out. They actually come off down on an angle. So I can use the analogy, if I've got this bucket here, let's say it has two handles on it. Let's make believe the handles are ribs. So naturally, gravity will pull the handles downward to the side of the pail. If I measure the distance in this position from here to here, it's going to be some distance. But if I lift both handles, what have I done to the distance between them?
Move them further.
Increase them. I've increased them. So when I contract the muscles to lift the ribs, the distance between the ribs going side to side increases. Also, the distance between the ribs front to back increases. So if I had a circle and I increase the distance side to side and front to back, what will I do to the size of that circle?
Make it bigger.
I'll increase it, I'll make it bigger. So I increase the circumference of the chest just by elevating the ribs. What muscles elevate the ribs? A and P1 people. Now I know you had this. Yeah, but Dr. Ryan, that was so... I effing hated that layout. What muscles are in between the ribs?
Give me some options. I can get it with some options.
The muscles in between the ribs.
Short ribs or braised ribs?
Oh my God, Julian, you're killing me.
It's a full rack. That's what you're eating, these muscles. space in between's filled in with
I know
muscle,
it
so
is.
it's something costals.
Intercostals.
Intercostals!
I almost said that, but I didn't.
Why didn't you say it?
Because I thought I was going to be wrong like I normally am.
No, do the intercostals.
Well, I've said like 80 wrong answers already, so you should.
Which ones? Which?
External.
Correct. External,
Take a big chance.
external intercostals, because they go from an upper to a lower rib, so they pull the ribs up. Okay? So what's the matter?
Nothing, my brain's just off.
I've increased the size of the chest front to back. So I've increased width and length. But to increase volume, what are the three measures of volume? So now we're in geometry. Length times width times height. So I've increased two of the three dimensions. How can I maximize the volume increase? I've increased width and length, so now I want to increase height. So now I got to ask another muscle to contract. And this is basically the floor,
Diaphragm.
the diaphragm. When the diaphragm contracts, gang, it goes in a downward direction. So in essence, the floor of the thoracic cavity is going toward your feet, thus creating a space to allow the lungs to expand not only front, back, side to side, but top to bottom as well. So we increase the size of the chest cavity in 3 dimensions, so that means we increase the size or the volume of the lungs in 3 dimensions, and that causes the pressure inside to drop. When that occurs, when the pressure in the lung drops below the atmospheric pressure, providing there's no blockage, the air will flow from out to in. Does that make sense? We call what I've just described inhalation. Now notice that inhalation required, no matter what we were looking at, it required muscles to contract. It required the intercostals, and it required the diaphragm. So you have to work. You have to use ATP to inhale. We call the inhalation part of breathing, that's called the active process. That's the active process. So in essence, what is explaining how we are able to inhale is Boyle's law. Assuming we increase the volume, what does the pressure do in the lungs? It decreases. All I've done was explain how we carry out Boyle's law by contracting external intercostals and diaphragm. Not that difficult. Kind of makes sense. Now, there's some other aspects to this as well. And this kind of gets into a little bit of the peripheral physiology related to this. The reason why the lungs expand when you increase the chest cavity is because of their tissue makeup. They're made of a very flexible, rubbery material. And someone said, you know, if you change that material, no matter how far you expand the chest wall, if it's not that flexible rubbery material, the lungs won't expand enough. We call that measure of flexibility and easiness to expand the lungs, that is called compliance. That is called compliance. There are individuals, they can move the chest, they can move the diaphragm, but the lungs don't expand with them. So for example, let's say you were in, I don't know, West Virginia, and you've been working in the coal mines since you were 20, and you're now 60. What's that condition that coal miners are susceptible to from breathing in the coal dust? Black lung. What that coal dust does, gang, it causes the lungs to harden. It scars them. So they are no longer flexible. So they expand the chest and they contract the diaphragm, but they basically have a leather lung that doesn't expand. It's not flexible enough. So no matter how hard they pull, that lung's not going to open up far enough for them to get enough air in. So another measure of normal function is called compliance. So it's not just the movement of the ribs and everything. You also have to have normal flexibility of the lung tissue. What does cigarette smoking do over time? Same thing. It's going to scar the lungs. What would chronic bouts of pneumonia do? Same thing. It's going to scar the lungs. Anything that leads to inflammation in the lungs is going to lead to scarring, and it's going to make them very difficult to stretch. That's called compliance. So what we want is we want a high compliance. The higher the compliance, the more flexible the lungs are. So they have ways to measure compliance. Now another aspect to filling lungs has to do with the pathway that I just showed. Because to get the air into the lungs, it has to go through those tubes first. So there are disorders that affect the ability of the air to move along that. We call that airway resistance. The higher the resistance, the harder it is to move. Does that make that makes sense? So anything that increases airway resistance, so for example, COPD, that increases airway resistance because it narrows the airway. So notice COPD affects not only the lung tissue itself, it also affects the airway. That's why COPD is so nasty. It affects multiple factors that get air to move. I'm assuming they're still whistling, so I'm not going to look. Asthma. Now those kids that have asthma, their lungs are real flexible. Their chest expands real good, but are they breathing good during a asthma attack? Because what has increased to the point they can't overcome it? The airway resistance. Because the smooth muscle has constricted the airway. So you got an 8-year-old kid running around and all of a sudden kicks into an asthmatic attack. It's not a problem with his lungs, it's a problem with the airway. So that's treated a little bit different. They need bronchial dilators. So asthma is a problem with the resistance, not the compliance. So do you see how a disorder just picks one of the things you need to work and attacks it? And that's generally how diseases are. They always pick the thing you need to work, and then they exploit it. So it doesn't work, and now you have a problem. Now, we have ways to measure how these things are functioning. And we do that by these special tests. These are, I learned them as pulmonary function tests, PFT. Basically what they do, and you've seen athletes with this, you've probably seen pictures of athletes on a treadmill and they've got this hose or this mask on and they're breathing into it. They're basically measuring this. Because vital to an athlete's performance is their ability to breathe. Their ability to get oxygen in and carbon dioxide out to maximize the production of what? ATP. So what they're looking at are they are measuring these various measurements that explain how the system is working. They're called they're called pulmonary function tests, but the tests are broken down into two types of measurements. We measure volumes and we measure capacities. We measure volumes and capacities. Volumes are a direct measurement. We can measure the amount of air that goes in and the amount of air that comes out of the lung. They're direct measurements. Capacities we can't because we can't measure the lungs directly. So the way we come up with capacities is we take the volumes and then we add the various volumes together to come up with capacities. And I'll show you how that's done. Has anyone ever had these done? You see kids have asthma all the
I
time.
had a little straw I had to blow into to blow a ball up in the air.
Well, that's incentive spirometry. That's a crude way of
Doing
maintaining normals of these.
Okay.
Okay? So you get that up to a certain height, the assumption is you're getting enough air in and out in order to do that. If I had somebody with COPD, that ball's not going to go up as high. These are actually, you breathe into a machine and the machine's going to give you a printout. This to the lungs is like the EKG is to the heart. Does that make sense? This is what a pulmonologist would look at. And they do it under all various conditions, before the medication, after the medication, so they get an idea how well the medication's working. Okay? Believe it or not, we used to order these for little kids, that doesn't have to be little, but young adults, kids that had scoliosis. That's stupid. Why are you doing that? Because scoliosis affects what structures? Spine. What are attached to the spine?
Ribs.
Ribs. So if the vertebrae are out of place, the ribs are out of place. So if you've ever seen somebody with severe scoliosis, that deformity is preventing the ribs from expanding. So it's knocking out 2 of the 3 expansions. Diaphragm works, but they're knocking out the ribs. So what they would do is send them down to the pulmonology lab, run these tests, and then you get a printout, and they would say they are functioning at, 30% capacity, which means they're not breathing very good. They're functioning at 30% of what their normal breathing is. So they're getting 1/3 the air in that they should. So that might be an indicator, maybe we should do surgery. So what they'll do is go in and straighten the spine and put the ribs in a more anatomical position. They're more upright, so that will allow more expansion and more breathing to take place. Does that make I think they do scoliosurgery because it's Thursday and you have brown hair. I think that's what they do now. But in the old days, it was, you got a little bit, you're just not going to win a marathon, fine. But you're fine. You can go upstairs, you're not having heart attacks, you're not having chest pain, that's fine. But when they started to get to that, then you got to do something. Okay? So these are used for a variety of things. Now, what are some of the measurements? The first thing they're going to do, they're going to put you down on a chair. They want you to relax. They want to measure the amount of air you're breathing in and exhaling, inhaling and exhaling, just sitting down like watching TV. We call that volume that they measure, that's called your tidal volume. Tidal, not tidal, tidal volume. What are the tides? Anybody can tell me what tides are? It's detergent.
I was just gonna say waves.
Waves. When we went to the beach and we were holding hands and we were dive bombing in the sand and stepping on clams. Oh, it was so nice. And the water came up and then it went back. And then it came up and then it went back. And then it went.
We got it.
So we inhale, water comes up, and then it goes back. It comes up, and then it goes back. Tidal volume, like the waves, come in and out. I like that. Puts me on spring break, 1979. Doing all types of high diving in the sand. Ooh. This normal measure is your starting point. The amount of air you inhale and exhale in your tidal volume is 500 milliliters. And this becomes one of the measures that they gotta, if this is too low, that means you can't even attempt to be active because you're not breathing enough just to watch TV. Wait till you see when someone can't get 500 milliliters in. If you take a baby that's sleeping, just pinch their nostrils. Watch them fight to try and kick in that air. What?
Can't do that. Don't pinch a baby's nose.
Why?
Because.
It's amazing your kids are still alive.
But that's what they're there for.
Amazing his wife
They're
is still alive.
experiments.
No.
See, your persona, this is the beauty of science.
Oh shit.
Science, it doesn't put a face to anything. It doesn't put an emotion. It doesn't say if it's good or bad. It doesn't do any of that. It just is. And these are what the results are.
But your kids shouldn't be experiments.
But how are you gonna conduct science?
On your ex-wife, okay.
Yeah, but she has access to phones and water. The kids, they don't. Little kid, when they still got that frog shape while they're sleeping there. You just Restless.
Well, yeah, because it can't breathe.
I don't know, I looked at things differently. When I saw that little thing pulsating on their head, that cerebral artery there with the soft spot, I'm pressing on it like Doug, because I want to feel that thing. Didn't you do this?
No,
You probably shouldn't
never.
push on the soft
You're not
spots.
supposed to.
Are your kids okay?
Maybe that's why they need help with math, because you pressed their soft spots, took away their oxygen.
No. The reason why they need help with math is because the other half of them is Polish.
Okay.
Polish, Serbian. They can't do math.
That's awful.
What?
This makes me laugh.
The Irish part can do math.
How many pints can you down in an hour?
Yeah, exactly. If I start with 10 and I drink 10, I have none left. Perfect math. It balances out. Stoichiometry. All right? So tidal volume is absolutely crucial. That's our starting point. If we can't maintain that, gang, we now have to start to work just to breathe. So what they will do, if you come in and you don't even need to hook someone up. If they're sitting there, difficulty breathing, you just automatically assume their tidal volume's low. That's when they put the cannula on. They increase the amount of oxygen you have available. So even though you're taking in small quantities of oxygen, there's more oxygen molecules in that small quantity than would be a large quantity of air. Does that make sense? So that will allow you to get more oxygen into the blood, because there's not a whole lot I can do with something like COPD or whatever. I can't reverse the hands of time. The only thing I can do is make more oxygen available to you. And that will usually put them, because now the brain's not sending out signals to muscles, gotta breathe, gotta work harder, and it calms them down. Kids that are in asthma, where they have that, they can't get that exchange, give them the oxygen and nebulizer, you'll see them calm down instantly. Because the more you got to work, the more agitated you get, the more ATP you need, but you're not getting enough oxygen to produce the ATP, so it sets up a positive feedback. When you can't breathe, you start to get very, very aggressive and agitated. And you don't want that, because sympathetic nervous system requires you to use more ATP, but you don't have enough oxygen to produce it. So that's tidal volume. All right, we'll call it quits here, because I see I'm not even going to get through the next measure. We'll finish the volumes up next week, and then we'll